Well, as regular viewers will know, I'm deeply concerned about the lack of moral clarity in Australia about the just war Israel is pursuing against Hamas terrorists in Gaza. The Albanese government has been weak and the media largely silent as Muslim hate preachers in mainstream mosques like Lakemba and other Western Sydney Islamic centres have spouted violence against Jews and even Christians. Our university vice-chancellors have also been weak as their ignorant students they're supposed to be educating, have set up camps in their quadrangles and chanted slogans supporting genocide of the Jews. All the while, Israel, which has achieved the lowest civilian casualty rate in any urban war, and I'd hasten to add that any civilian death is a tragedy, of course, but Israel is being demonised as if it is the real villain. It's as if the rapes, murders and kidnappings of October 7 never happened. Now, our political and cultural weakness is fueling an ugly wave of anti-Semitism, the likes of which I never thought I would see in Australia. Joining me now is the proud Jewish parliamentarian from the Liberal Party, Julian Leeser, the member for Berowra in Sydney. Julian, thanks so much for your time this morning. You're coming to us from a busy parliamentary sitting in Canberra. Why do you think there has been such a failure of moral clarity in Australia about the war in Gaza?
Well, thank you so much, Lyle, for having me on, and I'm proud to be an Australian parliamentarian in the Australian Parliament, and I'm proud to stand for the rights of all Australians to enjoy the benefits of this country free of discrimination, of harassment and vilification. But what we've seen over the past 6 or 7 months has been this lack of moral clarity from so many of our leaders, whether it's our political leaders and their failure to singularly and pointedly condemn the anti-Semitism, which we've never seen in this country. I mean, there have been Jews in Australia since the First Fleet, and Australians should be proud that we are one of the few countries on the planet that has never had any formal discrimination against Jewish people. And of course, Jewish Australians have flourished in every imaginable field and that they've given back. You know, when a free people worships a free God and are allowed to be free, there's no limit to what they can achieve. And that's been the story of Jewish Australians. But whether it's government members, whether it's university vice-chancellors, whether it's the police, whether it's the disgraceful Australian Human Rights Commission, the lack of moral clarity to call out anti-Semitism has been the most shocking thing I have ever seen in my lifetime. And this is a time of moral courage and moral clarity, as Peter Dutton repeatedly says. And all we want people to do is stand with their fellow Australians who have the right to enjoy this country peacefully in the way that all other Australians do. And yet, instead, there seems to be this backsliding and siding with an organisation, Hamas, that we in this country have listed rightly as a terrorist organisation. And I think this is a very disturbing development in the history of our country.
It sure is. You mentioned Peter Dutton, and I have to say I think he's been very clear right from the get-go.
Absolutely.
And he gave a terrific speech in the Parliament this week. Let's take a quick look.
Gassed in the Second World War. And we've got people in our country today out there on university campuses and outside MPs' offices denying that that took place, or saying that the biggest attack on the Jewish population since that time, the slaughter of 1,200 people, somehow doesn't count for anything and that it shouldn't be condemned. And they should be ashamed of their actions, and it has no place in our country. And, Mr Speaker, we know that Hamas is using people, Palestinians, as human shields.
Now, Julian, this speech was part of a welcome bipartisan pushback in the Parliament this week against the anti-Semitic Greens political party. What was the atmosphere like in the Parliament when this happened? And did the Greens get the message?
Well, I think the Greens are beyond help, unfortunately. They are a party for which anti-Semitism is deep in their political philosophy. They have refused to vote for any of the motions in either houses of the Parliament that condemn the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October or that condemn anti-Semitism generally. Even this morning, when I tried to bring on for debate my private member's bill for a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on university campuses, they failed to show up for that debate. So they are very happy to have anti-Semitism run in this country. People think that the Greens are an environment party. But let me give you this figure. Since the 7th of October terrorist attacks, they've now done 10 suspensions of standing orders. only 3 of those suspensions have been on environmental issues. The rest have all been on the Middle East, and they have all been viciously anti-Israel, viciously anti-Semitic. I think more Australians need to understand who the Greens are and what they stand for. This is not a party of do-gooder environmentalists. This is a party of the extreme left who support terrorism and who are against fundamental Australian values like democracy and the rule of law.
I couldn't agree more, and I think Australians have got to realise that this is a party that's got a big foothold in both houses of parliament now, and they are extremists, they're anti-Semitic and they're anti-Australian. You mentioned the judicial inquiry that you're seeking to have raised into anti-Semitism and some legislation you brought up today in the parliament. How is that going? What's likely to be the outcome of that?
Well, I was very disappointed that the government didn't allow the debate to proceed. It's disappointing because the Jewish community and myself and the coalition, we have no faith in the Human Rights Commission's ability to conduct an inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus. And it should be said, the government has set up not just an inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus, but they set up an inquiry into bigotry against First Nations people and Islamophobia. And one of the points I made this morning is that as a Jewish Australian, I'm sick and tired of seeing anti-Semitism always lumped in with Islamophobia. When there is genuine Islamophobia in the country, it needs to be called out and dealt with. And there was genuine Islamophobia after the September 11 terrorist attacks back in 2001. But it's the Jewish community now who have been subjected to the worst anti-Semitism in our history. It's only the Jewish community that was subjected to a protest at the Opera House by jihadis and terror supporters calling for their destruction. It's the Jewish community who's had its artists doxxed. It's the Jewish community that's had to put up with the terrible convoys of hate driven in the suburbs. It's the Jewish community that finds, its students spat at and taunted with swastikas and the officers of its university staff urinated on. This is the anti-Semitism that's in our country, and this false moral equivalence is just tiresome. And it's particularly offensive to Jewish Australians who are almost always at the forefront, and I include myself in this regard, standing up against the bigotry of other people. So we want to see a separate inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus, and we want to see it conducted by a judge, because the Human Rights Commission is another body beyond repair. It's a body that for 6 months failed to condemn or say anything about the anti-Semitism that we've seen in Australia. The Human Rights Commission president failed to condemn Hamas at the Senate estimates last week. She failed to call out anti-Semitism. And the new Race Discrimination Commissioner, who the government wants to conduct an inquiry of this sort, when he was asked would he condemn, as the Prime Minister has done and as the Parliament has done, the phrase "from the river to the sea," I said he wasn't able to do that because it would depend on its context. And then you've had so many of the staff and contractors of the Human Rights Commission write and say the most anti-Semitic stuff, saying things about Jews that are unsayable on your program, and saying that the Commission in every one of its statements should do things like blame the terrorist attacks on the Israeli occupation and the like. This is very deep. I've called it systemic racism because that is exactly what it is. And I'm sick and tired of Jewish Australians having to put up with this rubbish. And that's why a judicial inquiry with an independent jurist, with Royal Commission powers, with skilled cross-examiners that can take evidence in private, so Jewish staff and Jewish students can come forward without fear of reprisals, is the only way to go. And I'm backed up by the Jewish communal organisations, Executive Council of Australian Jewry, which is the representative body of the community here, or just the Union of Students and the Jewish Academics body too.
Well, Julian, it's a shame the government won't take this suggestion up. What you've just outlined about the Australian Human Rights Commission is truly shocking. They get paid millions and millions of dollars from us taxpayers to supposedly uphold human rights, but I've never ever seen them uphold the human rights of freedom of speech or or protect against anti-Semitism, as you've said. It is truly shocking, and it's time we woke up. But this issue of Islamophobia, which you've mentioned as well, and Anthony Albanese always presents anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as two sides of the same coin, but we're not seeing the sort of protests outside mosques that we're seeing outside synagogues, etc., and all the examples, horrific as they are, that you mentioned. Is this a function of the fact that the Muslim vote in Western Sydney particularly, and in the suburbs of Melbourne, is so powerful now that it's now starting to influence domestic and foreign policy in Australia?
I think it's a function of the lack of moral clarity of our leaders, whether it's the Prime Minister or members of his government, whether it's the Australian Human Rights Commission, whether it's our university vice-chancellors, whether it's some of the other people who are supposed to stand up and deal with these issues, who've got the responsibility for creating an environment that's free of harassment and intimidation. And it just beggars belief that people can't see this, that they can't see that here is a group of Australians in the Jewish community who are subjected to this extraordinary anti-Semitism of a sort that we have never, ever experienced. Yep. And people lack the moral fibre, the moral clarity to call it out for what it is. It's a disgrace.
It sure is. Julian, what would you say to Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who's urging for Israel to cease its military operations in Rafah?
I think Penny Wong has a blind spot when it comes to Israel. Right from the start, when she called for Israel on the day of the 7th of October terrorist attacks to exercise restraint in its response, when she went to Israel and failed to go south to see the kibbutzim where this terrible pogrom took place. I mean, imagine Alexander Downer after September 11, who was the foreign minister at the time, saying, I'm going to go to America, but I won't go to ground zero. Yeah. That's the equivalent of what Penny Wong did. And she sought to reward terrorism by Australia changing its votes and positions in relation to Israel and Palestine at the United Nations. Now, like everybody, I want to see an end to this war. But the way in which we would see an end to this war is that Hamas returns its hostages. We know there's still roughly more than 100 hostages that they have there. We want them to surrender and give up their military infrastructure and weapons, because that's what this war is about. It is about ensuring that Hamas cannot mount an attack of this sort again, and it is about ensuring the return of the hostages. The war could be over tomorrow if Hamas did those things.
Absolutely, and that's where the pressure should be, not on Israel. Julian, just finally, if the university protesters and other left-wing elites today, if they were, and their mindset was running Australia in 1939, do you think we as a nation would have had the moral courage and clarity to take on Hitler?
No, I don't think I'd be here. I think, Tojo would have taken over Australia. I think... Hitler would have taken Europe and the like. I think it's very disturbing what is happening in the new generation. And this is the other reason why anti-Semitism on campus has to be dealt with now, because what happens on campus today is about what the future of Australia is like in the coming generations. And it's so important that people learn that anti-Semitism is wrong and that it needs to be called out, that it's not okay to be a bystander. Because if we're not teaching those sort of things, then we will have a future as a country based on conspiracy, not facts, a future based on social discord, not social harmony. And it is a terrible, terrible thing what is happening on our campuses. And this is why we need a judicial inquiry. It's for the good moral health of our country and for people to learn the facts of our history. That's so important.
Well, Julian, there's obviously a big job to morally rearm Australia, and we very much appreciate your voice in that project. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Lyle.